thanks to the museum and you guys for coming out. So I'm actually really surprised that there are so many people here to see a talk on Jews and tattoos because, you know, as we all know, Jews don't get tattoos, which is okay, completely false. Jews do get tattoos. The origins of the idea that they don't is from Leviticus 19:28, not the year 1928, but the passage, chapter 19, line 28, where it says that you shall not cut your flesh, you shall not make an incision in your flesh because of death. And the reason that is said is because there was a tradition in ancient times when people had a much different understanding of death. The person stopped breathing and, sort of disappeared in a way. And people were upset, and people are obviously still upset, but what they would do is they would cut their flesh and then rub ash in it, and that would make a permanent mark. That was done, ancient peoples in the Middle East did that, but for Jews that became prohibited. And so that was a general rule, do not mark your flesh. On the other hand, there's a passage in Isaiah that where God says, you shall mark your hand for me. And in fact, it's known that some Ethiopian Jews do tattoo their hands. So there are some Jewish sects that have done this, mostly Middle Eastern or North Africans, but it disappeared really thousands of years ago. Now, tattooing is, as we know it, is a much more modern art, and the origins as we know it start in the late 19th century. New York City was a center. San Francisco was also a center for tattooing. And as far as Jews go, one interesting place that I found tattooed Jews is in an 1886 publication called Professional Criminals of America. And this is it's a huge text written by a man who was I believe a police chief of New York City, who created really a catalog. It's almost like an encyclopedia of American criminals. And it describes, sometimes there are photographs and descriptions of each person. And if they have relevant markings, it's noted. And so each time a person has a tattoo, the author mentions it. And there are a number of Jewish criminals in this book who are tattooed. So this is the first place that I came across Jews with tattoos. Then I was looking through an old Yiddish newspaper in, I believe, 1927. It's called the Vorwärts. It was the largest and most successful Yiddish newspaper in New York City, with a circulation of about 900,000 daily. Really a major New York City Yiddish newspaper. And in the mid-1920s, they created an English section because they felt that the children of the Yiddish speakers should also have something to read in this paper. So from about, 1923, 24 till about the early 1930s, there were a few pages of English articles in this newspaper. And one day I was looking at microfilm and I scrolled through the English section of a paper in 1927 and I saw that article. Lou the Jew, Tattooist Deluxe. And this was probably about, 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And I was blown away. I was really, really surprised. And one interesting tidbit is that the English section often translated if the articles were written for the English section of this newspaper, they were often translated into Yiddish and then republished in the Yiddish section, in the next days. This article was never republished. And that was kind of striking. It was understandable why. And so it, sparked a little kind of side project, a little interest in Jews and tattoos of that period. And I began to find, first of all, you can, the bio of Lou the Jew is on the wall over there. Very briefly, he was born in 1880 in New York. His parents were German Jewish immigrants. He went to the, I think it's the Hebrew Technical Society School, where he learned wallpaper design. And I don't know if they're in this exhibit, but I've seen photographs of work that he's done, full back pieces that really look like wallpaper. It's like the same design over and over again. So he enlisted in the Army in 1899 and went to fight in the Philippines in the Spanish-American War, where he and a lot of other sailors, American sailors, discovered the art of tattooing. And because he was an artist, he was able to transfer this skill into work as a tattoo artist. And he wound up, getting, credit in this Yiddish newspaper. There aren't a lot of articles and information about him elsewhere. There's a great 1930 book by Albert Perry called Tattooing or Tattoo, The Secret of a Strange Art, or something like that. I'm sure they probably have it in the bookstore here. Albert Perry, who was really a Russian studies scholar, and he's the author of this article. He wasn't Jewish, but he had some connection to the editors of this newspaper, and he was a frequent contributor to the English section on all kinds of interesting Jewish aspects of popular culture. And so he somehow found Lou the Jew and wrote this article about him. So what's known about Lou the Jew is, in the realm of tattooing, is that he was instrumental in the creation of Flash, which is when you would go into a tattoo parlor and see on the walls or in the booklets that the tattoo artists have similar designs. So Lou the Jew was known for copying designs and mailing them to other tattoo artists in different cities, so they could share designs and recreate them, as they wanted. So, after I found this article, I thought, wow, this is really fascinating. What else is there on Jews and tattoos? And I began to find articles in other newspapers, mostly English language newspapers, about that really had to do with problems with Jews and tattoos. So the Lower East Side abutted Chatham Square, which was kind of like the little section of streets that divided the Jewish Lower East Side from Chinatown. And Chatham Square was sort of the center of the New York City tattoo industry. So it stands to reason that Jewish kids from the Lower East Side would wander to Chatham Square and they would see these tattoo parlors and they took an interest. So sometimes there were instances where kids would get tattooed. There was one episode where a kid came home with a tattoo of a tombstone and something like "Dear Mother" written on the tattoo. And he came home, and of course his mother was still alive, so she was somewhat dismayed, and she found out where he got it, and they arrested the tattoo artist. So it's so there were a number of different episodes like that. There was also an episode where a Christian preacher would lure kids into his church and then tattoo crosses on them. And so this happened to a number of Jewish kids, and it, for obvious reasons, it was a problem. So these are just a couple of the things that I found, in the newspapers regarding this. Now, there's, in addition to Lou the Jew, there's another well-known Jewish tattoo family that started in New York City, and it's really, it's almost kind of a dynasty, and that's the Moskowitz family. So in the late 1920s, or maybe the it's the late 1920s, a man by the name of Willie Moskowitz opens a barber shop on the Bowery. And barbershops often rented space to tattoo artists at this time. So Willie Moskowitz, he was born in Russia, and he came to the United States, I think, as an 11 or 12-year-old. And he had to go into business somehow, so he was convinced to open a barber shop. He did this. It just so happened that he rented space to a tattoo artist, and he realized that the tattoo artist was making more money than he was. And so he found that interesting, and a few doors down from him was the tattoo shop of Charlie Wagner, who was New York City tattoo royalty. Charlie Wagner was taught tattooing by a man by the name of Samuel Riley, who almost single-handedly in the late 19th century began sort of initiated the tattoo industry in the city. So Charlie Wagner was a well-known tattoo artist. He was a few doors down from Willie Moskowitz's barber shop. They became friendly, and Willie Moskowitz one day complained to Charlie Wagner about how the tattoo artists were making more money, and they weren't that reliable, and he was just sort of griping about his tenant. And so Wagner taught him how to tattoo, and so from his barber shop became more of a tattoo parlor than a barber shop. So it did fairly well, during the 1930s, in spite of the Depression, and in the 1940s, when World War II started, it became a really big business. They were apparently tattooing 40 to 50 people a day. And Willie taught his son Walter. He had two sons and a daughter, Walter and sorry, I can't remember everything. Walter and Stanley. So he taught his two sons tattooing. They went into the business, and the man who married his daughter Esther, whose name was Stanley Farber, he also became a tattoo artist. So the Moskowitzes in New York City, beginning in the 1930s, started this whole tattoo dynasty. Now, one of the strange things about New York City, and if just to go back to where I started with tattoos, the people who were more apt to get tattoos at this time were either criminals or sailors, people in the military. And this is also one of the reasons that you may or may not have heard the rumor that a Jew can't be buried in a Jewish cemetery if they have a tattoo. This is completely false. I suspect that the reason for this was created by Jewish parents who were sort of upwardly mobile and wanted to scare their children into not getting tattoos. But it's not false. And in fact, about when I first got interested in this, and I saw this article about 10, 12 years ago, I started calling Jewish funeral homes and asking if they would bury Jews with tattoos, and they said yes. They said you might not get a plot next to an esteemed rabbi, but they'll bury you. And one funeral home told me that when they have a patron with a tattoo, I guess it's a patron, I don't know. When they have to bury someone with a tattoo, they would wrap it in gauze, as if it were a wound. So this was one particular place. I don't think that's a regular procedure. In any case, the people who got tattoos prior to the 1990s were people in the military, bikers, criminals, not, let's say, upstanding members of society. So the Moskowitz brothers, were in a trade that catered to a particular element that a lot of people were fearful of. And so in New York City, there were a fair number, and obviously, there was a fairly large number of tattoo parlors in New York City, during the 40s and 50s. In the sort of elders of the city decided, the people who were running the show decided that, tattooing brought in an element that they didn't want. And so in 1961, they banned tattooing in New York City. And in fact, tattooing was banned in New York City from 1961 to 1997, which is pretty amazing. It's come back in a huge way, but it's really, it's kind of an incredible thing. So the Moskowitz family they saw the writing on the wall, and in the late 1950s, they moved operations to Long Island. And they, actually to Amityville. So if you've seen the Amityville Horror, you can. So they moved to Long Island and began working there. And tattooing remained in New York City, but very much as an underground art. And they tattooed their entire lives. Their children, for the most part, did not go into the tattoo industry. I can't remember exactly, but I think that one of their kids became a dentist. They sort of went into the professions. But one did become a tattoo artist. His name is Marvin Moskowitz, and Marvin still tattoos. He's based in New Jersey. So if there are some people who like to be tattooed by legendary figures. Marvin is the last remaining member of the Moskowitz clan who still tattoos, and he's available. So you can always find Marvin. So the last tattoo artist I will mention is a man by the name of Freddy Negrete, who's also still tattooing today. Freddy Negrete, there's no exact birth year for him. I believe he was born around 1950-ish. And he was, his father was Mexican-American, and his mother was the daughter of Jewish immigrants, German Jewish immigrants who came just before World War II. The fact that his mother had married a Mexican-American man was a problem for her parents, for the Jewish parents, and she sort of had to go off on her own. The father was killed in a gang fight, and eventually his mother was also killed. And Freddie was put into foster care. And he grew up in foster care. He wound up joining a gang. He wound up in, juvenile institutions, and then eventually in jail. But while he was in a juvenile institution, he had a roommate who had a lot of tattoos, and that interested him because he always loved drawing, and he was good at it. And so he started asking him about it, and he showed the guy that he could draw, and he began doing what's called hand-poke tattoos. Often people who who begin tattooing tattoo on themselves first, and so Freddie's first tattoos were on himself. They were on his hand, on his leg. He told me that they would take a guitar string and dip it in ink and just poke designs. He eventually got good at it and really sort of perfected his craft, and he unfortunately wound up going to jail as an adult. But because of his tattoo skills, all of the guards and police officers they knew began going to him to get tattooed. And he was given a special cell where he could tattoo people. And it was kind of a business. I mean, it was sort of very underground kind of thing, where he, sort of developed his business in prison. And when he eventually got out in the early 1970s, he connected with some other tattoo artists, and he began tattooing professionally. He is considered one of the fathers of what's called black and gray, which is a distinct kind of, really only black ink tattooing with a lot of gray shading. He's, in the tattoo community, he's considered a legend. He still tattoos today in this shop in LA that Mark Mahoney runs. I can't remember the name of it. It'll come to me later. So, but he's a very well-known figure, and a biography of him was written a few years ago that's excellent. And one of his issues, and there's to a large degree, his tattooing is not related to the Jewish aspect of his life, but he is. There was a point in his life where he was addicted to drugs. He went to drug rehab and wound up in a Jewish drug rehab center that that helped him a great deal, and as a result, he's very much beholden to that, and he is a great supporter of them, and he's always wearing a Star of David, and he has a giant back tattoo of Moses. So it's really very much a part of his life, and he's he's sort of one of the few tattoo artists from the period that precedes the 1990s, where tattooing became, very much, a widespread art among, among everyone. And one last thing I'll mention is in the mid 1990s, a magazine came out of San Francisco, I believe, called Dovka. It was this Jewish magazine. The editor was this guy named Alan Kaufman, who I think lives in Oakland. He's originally from the Bronx. And one of the first things he did is he put this woman on the cover who had a lot of piercings and tattoos, and he draped her with a tallis. And this, it's no longer shocking, but this was considered somewhat shocking for a Jewish magazine to present at that time. Now I happened to find a poll from 2007. It was a Pew poll that said that Jews from the ages of 18 to 40, or 40% of Jews from the ages of 18 to 40 have tattoos. That's pretty significant. Whereas 10% of Jews from the ages of 40 to 60 are tattooed, which is actually still surprising to me. Not something that I really expected, and what's amazing about tattoos is that you can hide them. It's, people get them in places where they know they won't be seen, and I think that for many years Jews did that, but now, people are sort of out loud and proud with their tattoos and are very happy to have them. And you can find people with very, incredibly amazing Jewish oriented tattoos, whether they're hamsas or Hebrew text or anything like that. So I think I'm out of time. Is that true?
Yes, but now they're pretty fresh.
But I'll be happy to answer questions if you have any. So thank you.
What tattoos do you have?
I can't tell you. No, you know what? It's funny. I have no tattoos, but the one tattoo I considered getting was a hechsher, which is a certificate of kashrut. It's like a kosher certification. I wanted to get a basar kasher, a kosher meat certification on my ass as a private joke between me and the Chevra Kadisha and me and the Burial Society. But I never did it. So.
I would have believed you if you said
Yeah, I know.
That's great. So is what was shocking about the woman with the tattoos and the tallis on Dovka, was it the tattoos or that it was a woman wearing a tallis?
I think it was all of it. It was like the whole package. It was the whole package. But Alan told me he took a lot of flack for that people were really kind of, shocked.
And what year was that?
This was like 94, 5, something like that.
Just wondering if there's a connection between Freddy Negrete and Donna and Hardy. They were connected in any way, so they were around the same time.
I'm sure they know each other.
Okay.
Freddy Negrete was always based in LA, so he's a very LA guy. And the people he worked for and with there are all LA people, but I'm sure they know each other. They're definitely, yeah.
started with people bringing these things back from Chinatown and then
No.
converging over into the Jewish section?
No. So these tattoo parlors, these tattoo parlors were mostly on the Bowery. The Bowery was Skid Row. This was, there was this, sort of Bowery mission, and a lot of, sort of homeless men. It was the bad neighborhood, and that was where, these industries operated. It was sort of the lower end of things. They were neighborhoods that, where no one would really bother them. You could sort of do what you want. And it was not that it wasn't illegal or anything. You could, tattoo parlors were perfectly legal, but it was the type of environment that was very rough and tumble, and police weren't there a lot, and there were a lot of criminal elements. During the 1930s, during the 1930s, the Moskowitzes, in addition to having the barbershop tattoo parlor, they also were bootleggers. So, there was a lot of activity going on in that neighborhood that wasn't, on the level. Sure. Anyone else? Okay. Thanks so much.